Hey folks, David Stewart here. April is finished, so it's time for our analysis of the mighty Final Fantasy IV, originally released as Final Fantasy II in the United States. More on that in a minute. This review is going to focus on the version differences and especially the gameplay and story, though I will tell you that I will probably make some additional content on the story because there's actually a lot to talk about there that I think is very useful for people who are writing or trying to create video games. Now, whenever there are discussions about what the best Final Fantasy game is, Final Fantasy IV often comes up, and there are very good reasons for this. It's one of the first games in this series where the narrative takes a central role in the entire experience, and indeed it has a very good story. A story that has had a lot of lasting impact, especially for those of us who played it in the early 90s. It was one of the first JRPGs that a lot of people played on the Super Nintendo, and there's a lot of nostalgia behind it, but going back and revisiting it, I can say that it is certainly not just nostalgia that makes this game good. There are a ton of good qualities. Now, before I get into those, let me go ahead and talk about the version differences, because there is no game that I can think of inside of Final Fantasy or out that has as many different versions of as many different qualities to choose from, sometimes wildly different, and they're all called Final Fantasy IV, well, except for one. So, the original Final Fantasy IV was released for the Super Famicom in Japan. When Square was looking to send it over to North America, they made a decision to make the game easier because they believed that the gamer base over in North America and in Europe was of a younger demographic and wouldn't be able to handle the difficulty of the original Japanese version. So they created an easier version and had that translated into English and sent over. That easier version became the basis for another Japanese version called Final Fantasy IV Easy Type, but it's going to get way more complicated than that. Not only is the gameplay different between the original and the Easy Type, there's also a different script in Japanese because presumably younger players would be playing it, so they simplified the script and the ability to read that script. As of right now, I am uncertain as to which of those versions became the basis for the North American and European English translations of Final Fantasy IV. In fact, no one really seems to know who exactly did the translation for Final Fantasy IV. It wasn't Ted Woolsey. It was actually some Square employee in Japan who happened to speak English, and a bunch of other people in the company helped after hours to edit the script and get it ready to ship into North America. So things like "you spoony bard" are not Woolseyisms. They're from whoever translated it from the Japanese over in Japan. In fact, Final Fantasy IV has a very odd translation history that is very unique among games or really any kind of media. And I'm going to link you to a website where a guy goes through a bunch of the different versions of the game and evaluates the translations from the original Japanese. And as each game is released, or each different version of Final Fantasy IV is released, there's a revision of the script, but not necessarily a retranslation until we get to a certain version much later on. It's way more than I can get into in this video, so if you're really interested in all the different weird variations of the translation, go ahead and check that website down below. It is on the website Legends of Localization. So why is it that the original version of Final Fantasy IV released in North America was released as Final Fantasy II? I've gone over this in other videos. It's because the actual Final Fantasy II and III were not released in North America, and so they released Final Fantasy IV as Final Fantasy II so that consumers wouldn't get confused. Of course, the confusion will come later when Final Fantasy VII comes out, because Final Fantasy III was actually Final Fantasy VI, because Final Fantasy V wasn't released in the United States. It's all very confusing until you figure out that this is just Final Fantasy IV. So if you're going back and looking to find an original SNES cart, it's going to be Final Fantasy II, or if you're trying to find the original ROM, it is Final Fantasy II that you are looking for. The next version that you're likely to find is actually for the PlayStation 1, which was released in a physical format in North America as part of Final Fantasy Chronicles, a 2-disc set that included Chrono Trigger of all things, not actually a labeled Final Fantasy game, but definitely from the same studio. This is based on the original Japanese difficulty of the game, not the easy type version that was made for the Super Nintendo. So if you're looking to play the original graphics from the Super Nintendo, but have the Japanese difficulty and have an official English translation, the PlayStation 1 is the game for you. The load times are not bad on this one compared to Chrono Trigger, and this is because the total game size is small enough that I think the PlayStation 1 can load almost the entire game into RAM without any sort of problems. If you're looking for the game in Australia or Europe, though, it's Final Fantasy Anthology, which only makes things more complicated. This was originally released in 1997 in Japan, but it didn't come to the West until 2001, well into the lifespan of the PlayStation 2, so most people were playing Final Fantasy IV PlayStation 1 version on their PlayStation 2. The next version, which you are unlikely to encounter, is the Japanese version for the WonderSwan Color. This became the basis for a Game Boy Advance port that was released in 2005. This featured new 2D graphics, more colors, redrawn sprites, redrawn backgrounds, some character portraits, and another revision of the PlayStation 1 script. So it's different yet again, but it doesn't discard the PlayStation 1 script and go from scratch. Instead, it just changes a bunch of little things here or there. It does have some bonus dungeons, but this is actually a version that I don't recommend if you are finding a North American cartridge, and that is because the North American version includes a bunch of different gameplay bugs, too many to list here. Some are game-breaking, some just make the game far easier than it actually needs to be, where monsters will never have a turn to attack if you do certain things. The European version apparently fixes a lot of those bugs, but that might be harder to acquire in physical format. Obviously, if you're playing off of a ROM or on a virtual machine, that's not going to be that much of an issue. I would play the European version if you're really dead set on playing the Game Boy Advance version. The other thing with the Game Boy Advance versions is that it's lower resolution, so it's not going to look quite as sharp as some of the other versions on this list. After this, in 2007 and I think 2008 in North America, you get a complete floor-to-ceiling remake of Final Fantasy IV using 3D graphics for the Nintendo DS. This was done not by Square, but by Matrix Software. This version includes reorchestrated music, it includes voiceovers, it includes bonus dungeons, it includes new difficulties like an extra hard mode, and it includes extra gameplay elements like skills that you can teach to your various characters that they can use regardless of what class they are. It also features a brand new translation from scratch that is probably the most accurate of the bunch. This is also the basis for all the future versions of Final Fantasy IV in the West. So the iOS version and the Android version are based on this Nintendo DS remake, as is the Steam version if you choose to buy the Final Fantasy IV Complete Collection on Steam. Now, I can say in general that this is a very good version of the game to play if you are interested in the gameplay and the story. However, a lot has changed graphically since 2007, and these 3D graphics for the Nintendo DS have not aged well. And they've aged particularly poorly if you play them on a large PC screen, so if you're playing the Steam version of the game. You'll notice that the character models are very blocky, they're very low poly count, and the textures are very low resolution. It generally does not look like a very good game in 2021. I also don't love the voiceovers, but they're not omnipresent. They're present in the various cutscenes that exist, and otherwise you're interacting with the game through text, as is traditional. I should also mention that the Steam version of the game, which is part of, quote, the Complete Collection, includes a 3D remake of Final Fantasy IV: The After Years, which was also originally a 2D game that originally came out for, I think, a phone platform in Japan, and then later for WiiWare over here in the United States and in Japan. I'm personally not a huge fan of the After Years, but you may want to give that a play if you want to experience more Final Fantasy IV or learn a little bit more about the backstory of the world. Now I will mention the last version of this game on this list, which is the version that I played on stream, which was for the PlayStation Portable and released in 2011, 4 years after the 3D remake. This version is a 2D version of the game, very true to the original story and the original gameplay of the Japanese version for Super Famicom way back in 1990 or 1991. It features brand new graphics, very enhanced color palette, high-resolution sprites, high-resolution backgrounds, but none of them lose the look and feel of the original pixel art from the Super Famicom. This is because they're based on one of the original versions of the After Years, the 2D version of Final Fantasy IV The After Years, which featured upscaled versions of the sprites from the Super Famicom. So in general, I think it's the best aesthetic version of the game as far as remakes go. And if you were deciding I want something a little bit more high-res and more modern looking than the Super Famicom version, but you don't want to lose that pixel art, this is definitely the correct choice, is the PlayStation Portable version. You also get to choose between the original Super Famicom soundtrack and the reorchestrated soundtrack from the Nintendo DS version, so you get the best of both worlds as far as soundtrack goes as well. So which version should you play? I've spent 10 minutes explaining all the different versions. There's no real wrong answer. It just depends what kind of experience you want. The original Super Famicom version is definitely a good experience. It's a little bit on the easy side. But if you haven't played any JRPGs before, which, by the way, back in the day when we were excited to play these games, we didn't call them JRPGs. They were just RPGs. But if you haven't played one before, then I think that's a good place to start. I think the translation is not great, but it's not that bad either. One of the things that affected the translation for the original version of the game is that, kind of like the original Final Fantasy, when you're translating from Japanese, you only have so much space to write in the letters, and English is just a less efficient language as far as its written component than Japanese, which meant you had to make a lot of little sacrifices, and you also had to make things okay for Nintendo of America, which was very censorious at the time. So you couldn't have curse words or things like that in your game. Thus, you end up with some of those cool lines like, "You spoony bard." So I think that original translation is still quite a bit of fun. If you're looking to play with the original graphics, but you want the Japanese difficulty, play the PlayStation 1 version, or find a fan translation. There's different kinds of translation injections for the Super Famicom version, which you can play. If you want the best aesthetic version of the game that's 2D, I'd recommend the PSP version. That's also based on the Japanese difficulty. If you want the hardest version of the game, you can play the DS version, or you just really want 3D graphics and a very accurate translation, I would check out the DS version and all the versions that follow. For most people, if you're looking to buy the game new in 2021, you're going to be playing that 3D remake. I feel like I definitely can recommend that version of the game to new players, and it's still going to be a very good experience, but the graphics really haven't aged that well. If you're playing it on phone, you're probably not going to notice it as much as playing it on your personal computer. All right, with all that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about gameplay, which is the meat of the fun of Final Fantasy IV. I'm going to be focusing on the gameplay for the Japanese 2D version of the game, not the 3D remake, which has different gameplay elements in it, so just keep that in mind. Final Fantasy IV was the first game in the series to use the ATB, or Active Time Battle System, and what this meant is that you had little bars that would fill up and basically tell you when what character was going to go next, and you had to select your commands while the enemy may be attacking. It basically gave the timed battle system, the turn-based battle system of the original games, an extra twist and made it feel a little bit more active, fun, and frantic. This is especially true if you turn off the wait option. So in the menus, you have an option to turn on wait. What that basically does is when you are in the magic menu or in the item menu, time freezes so you can look through all the items. For most people, this is actually what you want to select. You don't want to feel so frantic where like you have to, menu through your magic ultra fast before you get completely destroyed. But at the same time, you want the battle to be progressing when you're not in those menus. It makes you kind of think on your toes a little bit, and I really enjoyed that addition to the Final Fantasy game series, which is something that stuck around for many games after this one. Final Fantasy IV is also the first game in the series where the narrative really affects the gameplay, which is an odd thing until you play it and you realize what's going on. So when you start the game, your main character, Cecil, is a Dark Knight. He later changes classes into a Paladin after doing a little event in the story, which is a really interesting thing. And this continues on as characters enter and leave your party. They are certain classes. So the party makeup, your arrangement of classes in your 4 or 5, sometimes only 3-person party, changes based on where you are in the story. At some points in the story, you have a black mage and a white mage. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have a dragoon. Sometimes you have a monk. Sometimes you have Cid with whatever class he is, I think an engineer or something. Or you have a bard, and you have to figure out how to use that bard effectively. So the constantly changing makeup of your class keeps the gameplay very fresh and interesting throughout the entire experience. In Final Fantasy III, because you had a job system where characters could be changing what jobs they had, that kept the gameplay pretty fresh for a very long and epic game. In this case, it's not up to you, the player, what your party makeup is. Rather, it's a result of you progressing through the story of the game, which I think is very unique. At the same time, I think the story is a little bit enhanced by the characters coming and going. As characters maybe are injured or sacrifice themselves to save the party, you have a little bit of an emotional attachment to them because you've spent so long with them in the party. You feel like you've spent longer with the character than maybe you have in terms of strict story time. So the relationship between the gameplay and the story, I think, is a very unique one, and one that definitely makes this game a really fun and interesting experience. Just like the other games in this series, we have a micro, macro, meta level. The micro level is choosing what attacks you're going to choose in battle, trying to kill monsters efficiently so you don't lose a lot of health. The macro level is managing items like ethers, potions, that sort of thing. I'd say most of the interest in the game kind of comes from the macro level, really trying to manage your resources well. They give you a lot of help. They give you a lot of spaces in dungeons where you can use tents and save your game, save your progress. That's definitely an improvement over Final Fantasy III, where in some cases you had to do these very long, drawn-out dungeons without any ability to save your progress. And if you wiped, if your party died, you'd have to do the whole thing all over again, which can be a little bit frustrating. Also, part of the macro level is choosing what equipment your characters are going to have, but the equipment is mostly just given to you throughout the course of the story. So that element really is not a driving part of the thought of gameplay. There's not a lot of strategy to selecting your weapons in Final Fantasy IV. They're mostly just given to you. The meta level is mostly absent from Final Fantasy IV and is replaced by a story. Rather than thinking about what classes you're going to use when you just play through the story, and the story determines what the class makeup of your party happens to be. This, for a lot of players, is a step down from Final Fantasy III, and certainly a step down from Final Fantasy V, where you have this very interesting job system where you're trying to manipulate that in order to efficiently and quickly move through the challenges of the game. I will say, however, that the gameplay is very balanced, and in general, you're going to be seeing a fairly consistent challenge as you play through the game, up until you get to the moon, when the difficulty starts to really ramp up, and you have to think about doing the things like the optional dungeons down in the underworld, and maybe even grinding in order to get your characters up to a little bit higher level where they can survive the very strong difficulty of the final dungeon. But overall, I think the gameplay is fun and I enjoy it. And because the story is interesting enough to push you through all of those different set pieces and all of those different events, you're not really going to be too upset that your party makeup is not completely under your control. You'll be more interested in the story itself. I should also mention that in several versions of the game, including the PlayStation Portable version of the game, which I played, you can actually change your final party up towards the end of the game. You can go back to Earth. Palom and Param, for example, are turned back into normal people. They are no longer statues, and you could have Cid in your party if you wanted to have a different party makeup for the final dungeon and the final boss, Zeromus. I didn't do this. I chose to go with the basic party that you're given, the same party that I played way back in the early 90s on the Super Nintendo, and I thought it was fine. I thought the challenge was not so great that I needed to go and get different party members out. But those party members are available if you want to do the bonus dungeons afterwards. So you do get a little bit of that meta level gameplay, but really only after you finish the vast majority of the story. I will say, though, that for the version of the game that I played, and this is true of the original Japanese version, the PS1 version, there's a very high encounter rate, which means when you're exploring, you're going to get into lots of random monster battles, Prepare to have your exploration constantly interrupted. This is part of the game design, though. You need to have that high encounter rate to get your characters up to a high enough level to overcome the various challenges. It's all actually very balanced. But if you're looking for a game with a little bit lower encounter rate, or you don't like having constant random battles, this one can get a little bit tedious with the encounter rate. So overall, I give the gameplay a good 7 out of 10. It's fun, it holds up. It's missing a little bit of the higher level play that you get with Final Fantasy 3 and 5, but it's okay because the story, I think, makes up the difference. Let's quickly talk about production before I move on. It's too hard to talk about production with a game with this many different versions. I will say the PlayStation Portable version I really enjoyed. I thought the color and the aesthetics were great. I like the production on the original Super Famicom version as well. If you play the original Super Nintendo or Super Famicom version, one of the things that I think is interesting about it is that it really doesn't use the full capabilities of the Super Nintendo hardware really at all. You're going to see those capabilities on display when you play Final Fantasy VI, which was Final Fantasy 3 here in the West, and you can really tell the difference between using the full capabilities of the hardware and not. As a result, the original version of Final Fantasy IV has this very interesting 8-bit enhanced aesthetic feeling to it. The sprites are still not using a huge color palette, but they're using a bigger color palette than they used on the NES. Likewise, the backgrounds are not using a wide range of color palettes, but they're using more than they had on the NES. So it's kind of like a super 8-bit version of the aesthetics of Final Fantasy, which I actually like quite a bit. It feels very classic, and if you're going to play on original hardware on a CRT, it's going to still look pretty good. If you're playing on an emulator, I do recommend you use some kind of CRT filter in order to disrupt the feeling of those harsh pixels, which are really not there if you look at the game on a classic CRT. Games really did look better back in the 90s because the display worked more functionally with the hardware that we had at the time. The music of Final Fantasy IV is probably my favorite Final Fantasy soundtrack, aside from Final Fantasy IX or Final Fantasy XII. Those are the three that I think have the best soundtracks of any of them. Every single track is so memorable in Final Fantasy IV. The battle tracks, the town tracks, little music that occurs in what would be considered cutscenes today. There's so much good quality music in Final Fantasy IV. You can just put on the soundtrack and just listen to it sometime. There are two versions of the soundtrack. There's the reorchestrated version and the Super Nintendo original. They both have good qualities to them. I will say, though, that I think I like the original Super Famicom version the best. It has a tighter, punchier sound than the reorchestrated version. Yes, not as many voices are present, but we don't really need those. The hardware capabilities of the Super Nintendo were enough to communicate almost all of the musical elements that needed to be there for this music to have a good, solid impact. There are, however, a couple of tracks, including some of the Moon tracks, that I think the reorchestrated version just does a little bit better job directionally representing the ideas of the music. But in general, I think the Super Nintendo one is just a little bit better. All right, let's move on to the story, which is the big thing that most people are going to care about when it comes to Final Fantasy IV. Like I said, this was the first game in the series where the narrative took central control of the entire game. However, I think really when you look at the game in context, though, you see that it is one link in a long chain of evolution in Final Fantasy games for how story is presented. Final Fantasy III still has a very strong overarching narrative. What it doesn't have in its original version is a strong sense of characters. The characters are mostly blank slates, whereas in Final Fantasy IV, our characters are really our characters. We can rename them using, the naming way rabbit guy, but it's really Cecil and Rosa and Kain. Those are the characters. They have their own identities. They have their own motivations. They have their own voices, which is really a first in the Final Fantasy franchise. We still, however, have the same basic Odyssey format to our story, where the story's moving us through various locales, through various set pieces, and showing us different sorts of adventures that we have to go on, which are contributing to our final goal of, in this case, overcoming Golbez and saving Barren Kingdom, saving the world. And like Final Fantasy III, the stakes keep getting bigger as you go through the story, which I think is great. Each time you clear out a dungeon each time you solve a problem in one location, you are treated to a little bit of an expansion of what the story is all about until you finally get to the epic final encounter. You go to the moon and you fight Zeromus, and it's just such a satisfying way to present the story, that increasing set of stakes. So let's quickly talk a little bit about setting, characters, and plot, because I think that is the best way to approach this, since we have a real narrative, we have a real story in this game. So the setting is very similar to other settings in previous Final Fantasy games. You have a world, you have an underworld that you discover along the way, and you have airships and various vehicles that you can use to move around that world. As you gain access to those vehicles, you get to explore greater parts of the world and get to new locations that you weren't able to get to before. This is a pretty standard way of approaching the exploration that had been established in the previous 3 Final Fantasy games. Each location that you encounter in the story has its own set of people, its own feel to it. You have the Bard's Kingdom, kind of in the desert. You have a kingdom of monks that are in the mountains. You have an underworld full of dwarves with tanks. Each little area has its own flavor to it. And of course, Baron, which you begin in, the kingdom which has airships. And you even have a kingdom with some references to elves. So I think this part of the RPG experience, which is a setting that you want to explore, is done pretty well. Done as well as most Final Fantasy games, which I think this is usually a strong point of the entire series, is the setting and the desire to explore the setting and figure out how things work. You also have the great little addendum that you have this relationship with the moon that you slowly uncover the secrets of until you finally are able to go to the moon and discover about a secret race called the Lunarians. It's all very well done in the context of the plot and how you're progressing through the various locales in the game. Next, let's talk a little bit about characters, because this is where I think Final Fantasy IV has its biggest success, is with the characters. The characters are very memorable. They are drawn very quickly and accurately. They refer to large archetypes that we're familiar with in other stories and are used in the story in very appropriate ways. And in fact, I'll probably make some separate videos just on the various archetypes and characters that are present in Final Fantasy IV. One of the most compelling characters, of course, is the main protagonist, Cecil. He begins the game as a Dark Knight. This is one of those things where the gameplay is influencing the story and vice versa. So he begins as a Dark Knight, and he's basically forced to do some evil acts that he disagrees with. When he objects to them, he ends up being an outcast from his kingdom. So right away, we have a compelling character story where the character is doing things that he finds objectionable and is having a moral crisis. This makes the story very interesting right from the get-go. You also have his best friend, Kane, in sort of the best friend role, who acts in some cases as a foil to Cecil, but also acts as his own sort of motivator in the story. He's a very compelling character in his own right because he has a little bit of a bad boy flair to him, but it's really that he is a very strong and masculine character to stand beside Cecil and be his best friend that we find him so interesting and likable. You have Edward the Bard, who's a very morose and very passive character who has character growth where he has to learn how to be a strong and competent hero, how to contribute to the party, and how to help his friends, which he eventually does through his actual talents as a bard. So again, you have the gameplay ideas, this idea of classes and jobs, influencing how the story takes place and how the characters act. You have Cecil turns into a paladin through a story event where he discovers that he's not really evil, that he's actually maybe descended from this ancient race. And that's a great moment because as Cecil is turning away from the evil that he's forced to do as a captain of the Red Wings and Baron, he changes classes. He changes from a Dark Knight to a paladin, basically from a Dark Knight to a White Knight. And that is again where this gameplay is crossing over into the story and making the story have a bigger impact. And then in turn, the story is making the gameplay shifts have a little bit more meaning. I think it's very, very well done. You have characters like Tella, who utters the very famous "You spoony bard" line, and his quest for vengeance against Golbez, which causes him to destroy himself in a quest to uncover a very, very powerful black magic spell, which he finally does. It's called Meteor, and you actually reacquire the spell towards the end of the game, and that reference of how powerful it was and how it like destroyed this character makes you really want to use the spell and feel like you've really accomplished something when you level up enough to get Meteor with a different character. You have Yang the monk, concerned with honor above all else, and you have a very compelling antagonist in Golbez, who seems very mysterious at first, and then as you uncover more about him, you learn more and more about his tragic struggle and his relationship to Cecil. Things become uncovered in the final act, and it makes for a great redemption story for Golbez, not just Cecil. So again, the idea of a character who has sinned, going on a quest to redeem himself and become something that is good and do something good for the world is a very compelling character arc. You have fun characters like Palam and Param, whose banter between each other acts as a kind of comic relief. You have the character Sid, who's likewise a bit of a comic relief character, but also helps drive the plot of the story forward as an engineer who is able to fix your ship and give you access to new areas. I'll circle back around to Kane because although he's a great best friend, he also has his own redemption arc because he does betray the party pretty early on and in a couple of different ways and has to try to make up for that later. Lastly, you have Rosa, the white mage, the healer, whose love for Cecil really helps transform him from a conflicted dark knight into a paladin, a white knight who's able to achieve his destiny. And of course, you have this relationship between her class. She's a white mage. She prays. She is the one who is the support character who takes care of the others. And in that way, she is also taking care of Cecil. Cecil, likewise, when he becomes a paladin, gains abilities like cover that allow him to protect the other members of his party. All of that cues into his character type. This is some of the stuff that you may have gotten with like versions of D&D that have the alignment chart, is that Cecil's a lawful good. Part of his personality is protecting others, so his class also protects others. It makes a lot of sense how the gameplay and the character types especially interact with each other. The last thing I'll talk about with this epic analysis is the plot. The plot is a basic Odyssey format, which means that the characters are moving through various set pieces, and in each set piece, they have like a little mini adventure. They have a little mini challenge to overcome before they move on to the next one. This has been the format for Final Fantasy games since the first one and remains the format really to this day. I think this format is part of what contributes to the epic feeling of most Final Fantasy games. You really feel like you're on an adventure across various different new undiscovered lands, going on adventures and moving slowly but definitely noticeably towards some final and very important goal. The goal tends to grow in size as well, and this is something that Final Fantasy does pretty well. As you go through the various set pieces, the scale of the threat begins to get bigger. It's not just the king who's being bad and barren, it's this Golbez. It's not just that Golbez is taking over Baron. He's maybe trying to take over the world. He's trying to destroy all the crystals in the world. He's trying to get to the moon. Why is he trying to get to the moon? He's trying to free some evil entity on the moon. Now we have to fight that evil entity. The stakes really build up and up and up in Final Fantasy IV in a very organic way that I think makes the overall plot very epic feeling and more cohesive, I think, than previous titles in the series. So it starts off as a simple quest to save the kingdom, escalates into a quest to save the world. Along the way, all the characters have to go through various trials of self-discovery in order to grow enough to overcome their challenges and to be the epic heroes necessary to save the world. I think it all works very well, and I think that is the strongest point of Final Fantasy IV. I give the story a 9 out of 10. I thoroughly enjoyed the story with this playthrough, as I did with other playthroughs. The only reason I wouldn't maybe give it a perfect 10 is some pacing issues that have more to do with the fact that it's a game rather than a story. The pacing is very, very quick early on in the game, and then it comes to a real slowdown once you get to the moon because the gameplay has to really take over. Your characters really have to level up a lot in order to get through that final dungeon and be able to kill the final boss. So you end up missing a lot of that quick, hard-hitting plot feeling that you had earlier in the game. The first 10 or 15 hours of the game go by very quickly and are very efficient, and then the last 5 or 6 tend to be quite a bit slower. And that's the only flaw, and it's not really a flaw. It just has to do with the format that you're experiencing the game in. So I really like this game. Playing through it again was a great experience. I hope you will give it an opportunity to play through it. It's a good, in fact, it's one of the best examples I can think of where there is a very good crossover between the game mechanics and the story, where they actually enhance each other. Most of the time you have a story tacked onto a game, or I guess with some modern games, you have a game tacked onto a story. But in this case, they both go together really well. I think it's a great experience. It's not so long that you feel like you're going to be slogging through a game for 40, 50, 60 hours. It's a good, fairly compact experience compared to some other JRPGs. So I do recommend it, and hopefully you can find a version that is going to meet your expectations and enjoy playing this game. Still worth playing in 2021. Thanks so much for listening to this little review. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. You can join my mailing list at dvspress.com/list and leave me your comments down below with what you think about Final Fantasy IV. What's your favorite version? What's your favorite thing about the game? What do you think it does well? And what things you kind of wish it did better? So thanks so much, and I'll see you all next time.